can't show the microphone. Yeah, I'm using the board.
It comes on.
Okay. Oh, good. All right. So the two words. So I'll see how this works right here. Okay. The two words we talked about last week briefly are keva and kavana. And in our topic of daily spiritual practice, there's the balance between the routine and the spontaneous. The balance between the scripted and the spontaneous, the extemporaneous. And before we go into the question of 100 blessings a day, which is what we're going to explore today, I want to think about review some of our pros and cons for routine versus spontaneous. Meaning every morning when I wake up, I say Modeh Ani. That's the routine. Or some mornings when you wake up, you're just grateful that you're alive, and you say, thank you, God, for waking me up. And similar, scripted, saying the words Modeh Ani Lefanecha Melachai V'Kayam, or waking up and just finding your own words to greet the day. So what are some of the pros and cons of those two different sides? So the keva being the routine and the scripted, the affixed, and the kavana being the word for the spontaneous, and my heart just leapt, and therefore I said. So what are some of our pros and cons here?
Well, if it's scripted, you probably don't think about it as much. I don't believe you don't have the appreciation for what you really say.
So if it's scripted, your heart might not be in it, and even your mind might not be in it. Great.
I think it's also a function of one's personality. One is comfortable just coming out with what, obviously, I can hear. And it's just coming out and saying it without thinking, which has bad sides and good sides to it. I think that sort of falls in the middle, because someplace in the back of the brain is what it is that you really intend to say from Scripture, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But at the front of the brain that's leading to the mouth is the sun is shining and I'm grateful to be alive.
So some of us might actually have the words to come out, and so we don't need the script because we're more readily able to find the words. And some of us might not actually be able to grasp the words as easily, and so having a script for it might be actually what enables us to get there with our heart. Other pros and cons?
If it's spontaneous, you might forget about it.
If it's spontaneous, you might forget about it. You might, if you're not in the habit of saying Modeh Ani every morning, you might wake up one morning and forget to be grateful. All right, so we're going to go one more.
I just think if it's part of a routine, you've got it, with all the brushing your teeth and all the other
Right.
things that you do, you do it.
Mhm.
And you don't have to think about it, and you just know that this is just something you do. And it would be easy, perhaps, to not do it. Or if you were to break the routine, it's very hard to get back into it. Like if you exercise next to it, and then you hurt your leg, and
Right.
you stop, and it's like, oh, I don't know if I can do it anymore. So that routine is really good to force you to do it.
So the routine kind of helps us be consistent and helps us get into a practice.
I just to share some of us who were first that morning. Rabbi Greenberg spoke about almost a similar kind of thing and suggested that we spend the week remembering that everything we do is connected to God.
Mm-hmm.
Thought, in other words, instead of thinking this lousy driver in front of me in terrible traffic, it to pull back and say, this is the way it is, but God is in this whole process, and so chill, as it were.
So that means you can do that spontaneously, or if you're actually working on finding God in every moment, then maybe you're able to see God in moments when you wouldn't have seen God otherwise. For me, where that brings me is the idea of seeing everyone in the image of God is much easier when we're looking at someone we have affection for, or someone who's different from us in a way that maybe we have sympathy for. But for me, extending the spiritual practice of trying to see everyone in the image of God extends to people who frustrate me, which could either be the driver in front of me who didn't make a turn, or it could be someone just bothering me. And where I go with that then is, God frustrates us. I assume everyone in this room has been frustrated by God at least a dozen times in your life. So it's bringing whatever I do to God when I'm frustrated with God, it's bringing that to the people that I'm frustrated with. But that's another topic. You just got me started. I gave my senior sermon at JTS when I graduated on that idea of the image of God. So you can talk about it with me later. So I'm going to pass out our handout, and we'll get started going through here.
Do you keep from making
Anybody else
a
missing?
planned comment on something mundane? And I'm thinking of our son who came home and said he was at his friend's house and they've been having problems, and the mother said, "Oh, the plumber came, praise be God." And
Here's leftovers.
We just put them at the end of someone. Actually, yeah, and if someone comes in late, we can direct them in that direction. Thank you. So the question is, how do you say 100 blessings a day without it becoming mundane? The example being, the plumber's on his way, praise be God.
Yeah.
So we're going to hold that question of thanking the plumber for coming, because it's sort of actually going to come up in a few minutes. But that's one of the challenges here. I'm working with a student, I'm a conversion student, and one of the things she wants to be working on this year is praying every single morning. And she's just been praying every single morning for a couple months now. And she asked me last week, how do you keep it from being routine? She's hoping this is going to be a lifelong spiritual practice, and just a few months in, having only learned half the prayers, she's already feeling that. And so that is going to be one of the questions we're going to focus on, because part of it is, that's one of the problems, one of the challenges that I'm struggling with, most days. So we'll get to that. So yeah, just a few minutes. So the first text we're going to look at today is the source of the idea that a Jew should say 100 blessings a day. So it's going to be, they're quoting a verse from Deuteronomy, which we're going to look at in a moment, but don't read the Deuteronomy verse yet. So I'm just giving you what's going to happen in this source. Is they're going to ask a question, and they're going to be quoting a verse, and they're going to be doing a midrash on one of the words in the verse, which we'll unpack in a minute. All right, can I invite someone to read this first source, please?
It has been taught, Rabbi Meyer says, each person is obligated to say 100 blessings every day, as it says. And now, Israel, what does God ask of you?
Okay, so the verse says, what does God ask of you? Ma. That's the word for what? And they say, rather than, what does God ask of you, they translate it as, Mea, what God asks of you 100, or 100 is what God asks of you, which they interpret that to mean 100 what? 100 blessings. All right, there's actually a very concrete answer to what are these 100 blessings that a Jew is supposed to say every day. It's not that you're supposed to go through the day and have 100 spontaneous moments of wonder. In the Heschel or Soloveitchik way of going through the day, each of them, if they're observing in the traditional manner that they are understanding, as we spoke about last week, they're actually going to be saying over 100 blessings on any weekday, and probably somewhere in the 80s on Shabbat. So what we're going to do now is I want to try and figure out if we, among us, can figure out on a weekday, it's Tuesday today, on a Tuesday, what are 100 blessings that maybe a traditionally Orthodox observant Jew this day would be saying on this day. So let's get a tally going. All right, what do we have?
Thanking for waking up, thanking for their bodily functions.
Okay, so this is the plumbing piece.
Yeah.
So one of the blessings said every day, which I personally say multiple times a day, is the blessing for going to the bathroom. Oh, I should have had us grab Siddurim. It's one of the first blessings in the Siddur. Is it one that you say on Shabbat morning here? Okay. So it's the blessing thanking God for creating humans in such wisdom that you've created openings upon openings and cavities upon cavities. And God, you know that if one of them were to be blocked or one of them were to be ruptured, we could not stand in front of you and pray. Praised are you, God, Rufei kol basar, who heals all flesh, umafli la'asot, and who works wonders. So let's just think of a number. How many times? So people would say that. I try to remember every time I go to the bathroom. Let's just pick a number for how many times someone might go to the bathroom in a day.
Depends on your age.
10? Okay, that's what I was thinking. Okay, so we're going to say, actually I'll do it. I'll make them in English. So that one's called Asher Yatzar. And we're going to call that 10. What other blessings said every day?
Washing your hands before eating.
Okay, washing your hands before eating. So let's say that lunch and dinner both have bread. So that's going to be motzi and hand washing for lunch and dinner. So we're going to put that under the category of motzi
And breakfast.
and call that 4. So we're going to say breakfast doesn't have bread in it. And say, should breakfast have bread in it? All right, great. So, all right, so breakfast, so three meals are going to have hand washing and motzi, so that's 6. And if you've eaten bread, you're saying birkat hamazon, which includes how many blessings? 3. It's very long, or it can be long, but we're going to say 3. So that's going to be 9 for... Okay, what else?
Shema in the morning and the Shema at night.
Great, so Shema in the morning is going to have 2 blessings before and 1 after. Shema at Ma'ariv is going to have 2 blessings before and 1, I wrote this down, let me make sure. Okay, so that's going to have, so Shema, so it's going to be 6 for the Shema, plus on the bed, so that's 7 for the Shema. What else?
For light and darkness, isn't it a separate blessing?
So the light and darkness is the first blessing before the morning Shema.
Right.
Oh, there's also Birkat HaShachar, which is Bokeach Ivrim, Shasani B'Tzalmo, the whole kind of list. It's about... Well, I have in here Birkat HaShachar and Pesukei D'Zimra, which includes putting on talis, putting on tefillin, those list of 10 Birkat HaShachar. There's a number of blessings that come up in there. And the blessings for reading, for study of Torah, La'asok B'divrei Torah. There's 3 blessings in there.
But is that every day or is that Tuesday, Thursday mostly?
So there's blessings for the Torah. So there's blessings you say for the Torah every single day. It's actually an amazing blessing. So for motzi, every time you eat challah, or eat bread, one would make motzi. Every time you go to the bathroom, you say the blessing afterwards. But with the study of Torah, La'asok B'divrei Torah, we say the blessing once in the day. The idea being that one should be engaging in Torah study all day, which for our understanding to me means have things that we do be contributing towards the goal of Torah. So I actually have 27, just trust me on that one, 27 blessings that someone might say before even getting to Baruch Hu. So we're going to call that, we'll just call that morning. What else is there? So the Amidah, exactly, is going to have 3 Amidot on weekday, times 19 is 57. Anyone confirm that? All right, think we've hit 100 yet? We're over? Let's see if there's any daily ones. Plus snacks. Let's say at least 3 snacks, and you'll make a blessing before and a blessing after. I probably have more snacks than that, but we're just going to leave it there. Can anyone do a quick tally of that?
122.
122? So this commandment all of a sudden isn't actually that hard if one is...
I gotta grow.
There, approximately. You might have more snacks, might go to the bathroom more. So all of a sudden this text, that to me, the first time I read it, it seemed so impossible and absurd. Well, this might seem this is absurd in a different way. Before it felt absurd in the sense of, how in the world am I going to find 100 things to bless in a day? And then we get this and we realize, without being spontaneous, with just approaching the world the way Heschel spoke about last week, you easily fulfill this need. And so Shabbat actually, because one of the biggest kind of contributor here is this, which is 19 times 3. And Shabbat, since our Amidot are much, much shorter, we actually have much more trouble getting to 100. So one tradition and similar with Yom Kippur. Even though we spend most of the day in synagogue on Yom Kippur, because we're not eating and going to the bathroom much less, those of us who are fasting. So one custom you might see in some synagogues is people smelling spices, because there's a blessing that you say, the one we say during Havdalah, for spices, so that's a way to kind of get your number up a little bit higher if you're not saying the weekday Amidot or eating.
How about blessings over food that is not bread? In other words, the trees and from the ground.
So if you're having a meal that has bread in it, you would, just like we do for Shabbat meals, we would just make motzi, and the motzi is specifically on the bread, but it actually covers anything in that meal. So you wouldn't have to make the blessing on your apple if it's in a meal that has bread in it. So this is a very low ball number, that we're only having 3 snacks, and each snack only has 1 food in it. So I've already had 3 snacks today. I didn't have bread. But one thing I am working on, saying the blessings after the meals is something that I personally struggle with, but we're trying to at least say some blessing after the meal with our son, so he kind of learns that habit. So we're working on adding that in. All right, so imagine if this was your day. How would this feel in terms of the kava and kavanah piece of it? Very structured. Is that a good or a bad thing? Okay. So I think I can say that it's probably obvious, a little more obvious to us why it might be a hard way to live. Can I hedge that bet? What might this do for us in a positive way? How might this structure to the day benefit you?
Well, you're always attuned to what God would want. You're like following the rules. You're not just doing it. It gives you a set way to do it and always keeps God in front of you.
So it helps you know what to do next. It kind of gives you direction. For some people who want more structure, I feel like that's going to be a very positive thing. If one has this approach to halakha, one would feel that you are engaging with God at every single moment. For me, kind of as powerful as the idea that this is what God wants me to do isn't what's resonant. What's more resonant for me is this is how many of our people have lived for generations, and how many of our people have found a way to make meaning of the world. Whether or not it's what God wants me to do, it's what the Jews have found gives meaning and continuity to their lives. So for me, that's part of what the connection does. All right, let's look and see. Whenever I study a midrash, which is what this is, I always want to see the verse that they've quoted. What's it doing in its original context? And often in midrash, the original context is actually completely irrelevant, and it's very hard to find some kind of connection. Sometimes when it's a story, it's a narrative, you see that there's a little blip in the narrative and a midrash comes in to fill in a story. But sometimes you read the verse that a midrash is using, and you realize it actually means the opposite in its original context. So that's what we're going to find, I think, in this piece. Can I have a reader for Deuteronomy 10:12?
And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all God's ways, and to love God, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul.
If we can put the midrash on hold for a moment, if you were to read this verse and want to identify action items from this verse, what would you do? What is this verse commanding of Bnei Israel? Just pause and think for a minute. Forget the Midrash. What is this verse telling us to do? What are the marching orders that come out of this verse? Or that might come out of this verse that you might read out of it?
To think about God in everything we do.
Okay, to think about God in everything you do.
Before you're thinking of doing something wrong or evil, if you think of this, maybe you won't do it.
So it's kind of a conscience.
Yeah.
This verse is saying, before you act, just keep God in mind in what you're doing. Any other readings of it?
Or to be more charitable.
Okay, say more.
If you see somebody and you feel like you should be doing something to help them, this should, give you a reason to do that.
So the walk in all God's ways is what I'm seeing you take out there. There's a concept that the way we're supposed to move through the world is sort of by imitating God, by looking at God's acts of loving kindness and mimicking them. So there's a number of midrashim that derive all of the acts of Gimilut Chasadim from God's actions. So Adam and Eve were naked in the garden and God made them clothes. And from that we learn we should give clothes and provide the necessities to the needy. God buried Moses on Mount Nebo, and so we learn that we're supposed to take care of people who have died. And there's a number of different midrashim that take acts that God does towards humans in Tanakh, and we learn that through God's acts of loving kindness to those humans, we're supposed to do that in kind. And that's our way of walking God's ways in this world. So I read this verse, and I don't think about 100 brachot. I think about walking in God's ways in a much less concrete and more of a social justice, loving kindness kind of way. I think of this as a much more broader the conscience piece, but also kind of a lens to look at the world and say, what would be if God were to act in this moment for this person? I think of it, this verse to me speaks very interpersonally. And I don't really see it being about kind of concrete actions. How do you think, or why do you think the rabbis might have taken this verse and jumped to our 100 blessings?
In the beginning, could it have been a teaching tool?
Say more.
Well, you said you're trying to introduce blessings, so your son is accustomed or acquainted with it and so on. And maybe this was a building block until the person could do it on his own. Or
Meaning,
as Reformed Jews make a value judgment of what is good for us personally, as opposed to just saying an open-ended walk in God's way.
and so this verse maybe it's not actually that easy to decide how am I going to act based on reading this verse. And so it's kind of there's a lot of teaching potential in this verse, but then when you actually try and teach the verse, it gets very vague. But then if you bring in a structure like this, it becomes very clear that this verse that has this great beginning, what does God ask of you? That's an amazing opening. You want the teacher wants whatever follows that to have a lot of punch and be really powerful. And perhaps reading this verse, they want a little more to sink their teeth into, and they go into this direction.
Well, not only that, isn't it, you're supposed to be thinking about God all the time, but what better way to force you to do that than to make you go through all these things, this 100 blessings, so that 100 times a day you are thinking.
Perhaps there's a fear that if we leave it all to spontaneity, it's just not going to happen. And I think in the article I read by Danya Ruttenberg last week, she spoke about children getting in the way of her daily spiritual practice, but also being an opportunity to recognize the greatness of God's creations in that moment. We all have things that interrupt us and prevent us from seeing the greatness of this world, but often those things that interrupt aren't also the same things that are reminding us of the awesomeness of this world.
And one other thing is, that these are not commandments. I mean, even in Hebrew, it's
Right.
what does God ask of
Yeah.
you? And I think that then throws the responsibility onto the people. In other words, there's nothing bad's going to happen to you if you don't do these things. However,
Right.
God's asking, how are you going to respond to God?
Because we often talk about it being a covenant between us and God, but so often, so much of the God-human relationship is really just top-down. It's not actually a mutual pact. But in verses like this, we see that there is some kind of back and forth. The original translation that I had used was the old JPS translation from 1917, and it said, "What does the Lord your God require of you?" Which might actually hold something in the word shoel. The modern Hebrew word shoel means to ask a question. So I don't know actually biblically if the word does have the sense of require, but I think that it does leave more of space for us if it's ask instead of require. So in addition to the daily routine of brachot, there's also a multitude of brachot for moments of awe that are kind of already codified. Because often you can see something amazing and utter your own prayer, but Judaism has an answer for everything, not an answer for everything, has a liturgy for everything, I'll say. And so even those moments of awe are also scripted. So can you think of some moments of awe that we have scripted brachot for? Rainbow. So the rainbow blessing, which is an amazing one, because we see a rainbow, it's pretty hard not to be in awe of a rainbow. A few summers ago I was in Alaska and I saw a triple rainbow. And that, everyone was going outside. And actually recently there was a YouTube video of someone had found a double rainbow and had recorded, the rainbow with his own exclamations. And it went viral on Facebook because people were just so amazed by the rainbow, but also of how amazed this person was by it. But how many of us, when we see a rainbow, think about the original rainbow in the book of Genesis? Yeah. So the blessing I'm going to read is, Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam, zocher chabrit v'ne'eman bivrito v'kayam b'ma'amaro. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who remembers the covenant and is faithful to God's covenant and keeps God's promise. This isn't the covenant between Abraham and God. This is the covenant that after God destroyed the world, God told Noah, I will never do this again. And so the blessing is reminding us of God's apology for God's wrath and the commitment that God made to humankind to never do that again. And also the last phrase, v'kayam b'ma'amaro, who keeps God's promise. Now, it might take some of the spontaneity out of seeing the rainbow, but it also deepens the experience and connects it to past experiences of humanity seeing rainbows. This one I think is perhaps the best. Because it has that kind of, I'm going to say historical, but I don't mean historical. It has a narrative, a personal narrative reference to the way we look at the world in a way that a lot of the others don't. So are there any other kind of moments of awe, blessings that you can think of?
I don't know if there's, I assume there's one, but the birth of a child. And when I first look at the children.
There actually isn't a blessing for the birth of a child. There should be. And I know that some people, myself included, say Shechianu upon the birth of a child, which is kind of our catch-all. There's a blessing for the Brit Milah, and that's kind of it, which is kind of appalling. Whenever we think about childhood and birth, kind of in a broad historical context, the other piece that kind of gets thrown in there is how we're living in such a blessed time of such low rates of infant mortality. And that's the other piece of it, that there is a lot of kind of halachic, legal, Jewish texts around the area of loss of very young babies. And so maybe it's actually a relatively recent historical moment that we're able to say a blessing upon the birth of a child because we have a broad confidence that this child will probably grow up. So that's one of the pieces that whenever I wish Judaism had kind of more around early infancy, I feel like that's one of the pieces that's kind of going in the opposite direction there. There's actually a ceremony, I forget what it's called, but it's for a baby who's 30 days old, because the rules in terms of
The soul becomes, it's now a living being after 30. The soul is restored into God.
So after 30 days, there's an idea that a person who's lived 30 days, the soul is there and it's kind of at one with the body in a way that it's not before that point. Which is kind of feels dissonant, and God willing it's dissonant for most of us in our experiences that we haven't had to experience that, but the Judaism actually has an understanding of kind of what to do in those moments. But the idea that because at the 8th day is when the bris would be if it's a boy, but at the 30th day, and I actually have friends who actually had a very, very premature baby, and when the baby was 30 days old, it was clear that he was doing really well, and they had this celebration that most of us are blessed to not even think about that. I don't know if there's a blessing for that moment, but there really ought to be.
There are blessings when you escape danger.
Okay,
There's
there's
a blessing. There's a blessing if you hear good news.
So there's the blessing, let me do one at a time. So there's the blessing, you've probably seen it during the Torah service. When someone has just gotten over an illness, had a surgery, a car accident, or gone on a long trip. Often people come back from Israel, or my husband has lived in Egypt a number of times, and whenever he comes home, he says it. And it's thanking God for redeeming me from harm. And we respond and say, may God always redeem you to everything always to be good. And what was the second one you said?
You included it as a danger or recovery.
Okay, but that they're upon hearing good news.
Right.
Now, what does it do? So we often, hopefully in our lives, hear good news. What's your reaction when you hear good news? Just so pause and think for a minute of a time recently when someone gave you some good news. Okay. Okay, so we have these Jewish phrases, praise be the... So the plumber thing I was thinking about was saying the blessing for going to the bathroom, right? That is kind of a parallel to the plumber, I think of it, in that we have our internal plumbing, and it's a blessing that we often, if we say it, it's often just a rote moment. It's what I say between the bathroom and the classroom. It's what I'm doing on that walk, as opposed to standing still and being grateful. But when something does go wrong, gives the blessing an entirely new tenor. And that's part of the keva kavanah. It's easy to say the blessing for going to the bathroom without any kavanah, because it's just so keva. Of course I went to the bathroom, I do it a dozen times a day. But then when something goes wrong and I have that blessing as language for my daily life, that's when the kavanah piece comes in. When I'm actually thinking about it, because often these prayers that are gratitude, saying thank you God for having my body work, with a snap of the fingers can become a petition. Usually we say, thank you God for making my body function, but it can just as easily turn to, God, remember I can't stand in front of you if my body's not working. Please make it work. And so and same with the Amidah, which is other than the first and last 3 blessings, the entire 13 blessings are all petitions. God, heal me. God, make this a bountiful year. God, rebuild Jerusalem. God, heal those in my life. And they're all a mixture of petition and gratitude. And it's easy just to say those blessings without thinking of them, except when you're living in Jerusalem, there's a drought. That blessing, which you already have language for, has new meaning. The blessing for healing, it's easy to say it, just mumble through the words. But when you have someone you're praying for, it's a script that you already know that helps you through that moment. As for those of you who don't respond with Baruch Hashem or thank God when you hear good news, what goes through your mind when so think of a good news you heard recently? And what kind of thing might go through your mind upon hearing good news? So maybe we all bring in God. I want to see where the blessing for good news. Hatov v'hametiv, God who is good and makes good happen in the world. That's a nice one. So we have for smelling fragrant spices, fragrant trees or shrubs, plants or herbs, fragrant fruit, lots of nuance there. Upon seeing wonders of nature, including lightning, shooting stars, vast deserts, high mountains, and a sunrise. And that one we just say, Oseh Ma'aseh Bereshit, God who is the maker of creation. Separate one for thunder, the rainbow one. Seeing an ocean is what I never really, growing up on the East Coast, going to the beach multiple times every summer, it never really occurred to me that seeing the ocean would be a novelty. I'm sure all of you have barely seen the ocean, but growing up in a different part of the country than I did, I imagine some of you perhaps remember the first time you saw the ocean. Does anyone remember that?
Chicago, next to the lake, is like an ocean.
Right, I guess going to the ocean doesn't actually feel that different when you spend time on a lake that is endless.
I remember the first time I saw the Atlantic Ocean was from the boardwalk of Coney Island. And it was at first secondary to what was going on behind me, the park and all the rides and all the fun. And then looked out and far, far away there was a ship. I mean, I remember thinking about it. I never thought about it. I have thought about it for a long time. But I do remember that because I don't remember ever seeing the sailboats on Lake Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this huge thing which, when I first saw it, I thought, is it coming to shoot torpedoes at me? You know,
Mm-hmm.
it was a long time ago. And
Right.
that possibility that the ocean itself was so vast.
Yeah.
So vast.
Any other memories of the ocean? Do you remember?
The ocean.
What do you remember about it?
Mine was similar. It was Coney Island, and looked out. And I wasn't sure where I was and whether I was in Atlantic or not. And I asked some guy who was picking up debris what was out there, and he said, "That's Europe, dummy."
Often we feel very small when we see something that large, but then someone calls us a dummy at the same time, we feel even smaller. So the blessing, She'asa et hayam hagadol, who has made the great sea. And I think about in our context, knowing what the globe looks like, we've been to the moon and beyond, going across an ocean is something that's kind of taken for granted, that we can just fly across the Atlantic. Or if we were to take a ship across the ocean, the chances of making it there are very, 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 very good. And I think about the word in this, She'asa et hayam hagadol, who made the great sea. There's a certain unfathomability, if that's a word, about the ocean. It's not who made this ocean or who made all of the oceans. There's people who lived on the banks of the sea and had no idea what was on the other side. There's a certain kind of mystery and awesomeness that we forget because, we have a globe sitting at home and I know what's on the other side, and also because I've been there. One is for seeing a head of state. When the king of Jordan was in Israel a number of years ago, many Haredim, ultra-Orthodox people, came just so they could see the king, so that they could make this blessing. There's an idea that there's many mitzvot we can't fulfill these days because there isn't a temple and so we can't bring sacrifices. But also because there's many mitzvot, many of the 613 that we can't do in America because there's no king here. But there's a desire, especially in the mindset that every time you do a mitzvah or a Jew does a mitzvah, the world's a little bit more balanced. All these Haredim went to go see the king of Jordan so that they could make the blessing upon seeing a king. There's also a blessing for hearing bad news, which we often think of as being the blessing when we hear that someone has died. Dayan ha'emet, God who is the true judge. And that's one that I know gives a lot of people, is a hard one sometimes, because that's not maybe the words we want to say when we hear bad news. God, the judge of truth. There's one for returning to a place where you've had a miraculous experience. She'asa li, who did for me, nes b'makom hazeh, who did for me a miracle in this place. And then we have one on the page in front of you. Can I invite someone to read this next one, text number 3?
Rabbi Yehuda said, "One who goes outside in the springtime and sees trees that are blooming should say, 'Blessed is the one who does not withhold anything from this world, and who created in it goodly creations and goodly trees for humans to take pleasure from.'"
Reading that one, it almost sounds to me like someone, Rabbi Yehuda, maybe actually had this experience, that he went outside, he saw the beauty of the trees blooming, perhaps they had a very long, cold winter, and he's just pouring forth gratitude. This is longer than your usual blessing. But then it becomes the instruction of what you're supposed to say in that moment. So his, perhaps what looks to me like a spontaneous blessing, turned into, it went from being his kavanah moment to written down in the Talmud as what should be your keva moment. But I think each piece of this is a separate piece to focus on. One, who does not withhold anything from this world. It kind of brings in a theology there that God kind of has all this goodness. And if the world is as good as we know it to be, God must not be withholding anything, because this world is just so beautiful and so awesome. Goodly creations, goodly trees, just the goodness of it all, and for humans to take pleasure from. It sees God as a beneficent God in this moment. And whenever reading a blessing like this, I also have in my mind blessings like Dayan Ha'emet, God the true judge, which we say when we hear bad news. And this either could be someone who really is pouring out of their heart, or it could be someone who's not in a good place with God at this moment. Someone who is angry, someone who just suffered a loss, and they go outside and they don't want to thank God for that moment. And they say this line because they're obligated to say it. What might that do for that person? I don't think there's one answer. I think it can go in many directions.
Maybe it reminds one that we are human, and that it's God who does these things, and not that we're dumping it back onto God, but rather recognizing that there are just some things we have no control.
Okay, so it's ceding control and letting God be the master of all of this, both the master of the bad and also the master of the good.
But if you believe that God is good, it's very difficult, having been through a situation, it's very difficult then to think that God could do this. It's got to be something beyond God.
Okay, so it could, someone who has suffered a loss could say this blessing and believe it, but then, and feel it, but not be able to let God actually be Dayan Ha'emet, the one who did the bad thing too. So kind of separating, then what else is there out there?
That's the question.
That's the question.
What made this happen? What caused this to be? It couldn't be God if God is good.
Right. Hinging on the if God is good.
If God is good.
To me, when something bad happens and then you see suddenly the sun or it's a nice day, you say, well, this bad thing is transitory, it's going to pass. And you could say a prayer that hopefully I will get emotionally better and recover from this bad event.
So it could help you see that the good will keep coming and the bad will fade, transition, lead to a new phase. It also could make someone furious, right? It could also make someone furious. How dare you, God, make this tree bloom on this day in my life? It doesn't have to lead to the next positive moment with God, but I think what it does do is it keeps one in conversation with God. It causes one to keep having to talk to God even on the day when one doesn't want to. And this is the piece for me in thinking about how we see people we don't like in God's image. We might yell at God, so that's one option we might have for people that we're mad at in that moment. But we know we can't walk away, and we know we have to keep engaging, and we trust that there's goodness in God. And so when something bad happens, we're trying to look at a bigger picture. And for me, that's the most powerful piece about this, people we don't like in the image of God, is trying to find, or trying to assume, even if we can't find it, there must be a bigger picture for why this person is doing this thing, why this thing is happening to me in this moment. Another piece about this, having this practice of gratitude, in a psychology class I took in college, we learned that, make a pen for this, and a coffee stirrer. We learned, this is a social psychology class, they asked people to take a pencil and put it in their mouth like this, and hold it for, I don't know, 5 minutes, and then rate how they were feeling afterwards. Okay, pretty simple. Then they asked people, a different group of people, to hold a pencil in their mouth without their lips touching the pencil like this. Actually, we're gonna do this. Everyone has a pen. Put it in your mouth, and just have your lips around it like you're just holding it. Allow your lips to touch it. I'm not gonna do 5 minutes. All right, how do you feel? You had your lips away, and maybe there were others. How do you feel now that you've had the pen in your mouth, or still have it? Maybe the same pen.
Feels good that you don't have to have it in your mouth.
Okay. All right, so let's do it this way. Do it now with your lips away from the pen. Any difference? Much more effort? Okay.
You know it's there, but you don't really feel it.
You don't feel it because it's just on your teeth?
Yeah, you have no.
But there's a psychological thing, it's almost a smile.
There, that's the piece they were focusing on.
Because when you smile, just the act of smiling makes you feel better.
It sends, when your smile muscles are activated, it sends happy signals to your brain. There's actually a study recently that people who have Botox in their face can't smile as much. And they actually, many of them are not as happy because they actually aren't, the smile muscles, I mean, they're getting the happy signals from their brain to their face, but their smile muscles aren't sending all of those signals back. So the study showed that people who had their mouths in the smile formation found the task less onerous than those who weren't. And so that's just one of the pieces of kind of this daily routine of gratitude. When having your gratitude muscles going, whether or not you're actually thinking about I'm being grateful right now, that daily routine actually can have some of that kind of feedback loop. And now we're going to hear an opposite voice on saying blessings whenever you see anything amazing. Can I invite someone to read Pirkei Avot?
Rabbi Shimon says, one who is walking along the way of learning, if he interrupts his learning to say, how beautiful is this tree, or how beautiful is this field, the tradition considers it as if he bears guilt for its very life.
What? Reactions?
I disagree.
Why?
It doesn't relate. If you see something beautiful and you're doing a positive thing by saying, gee, this is great, this beautiful sun or tree or what. And even if you think it internally and continue on your task, that doesn't mean you feel guilty because you didn't appreciate it before.
Other reactions?
Someone's walking and learning, that means they must be doing this. And if you are distracted by something around you, you're not focusing on words of Torah as your word.
Right.
So you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of studying Torah.
All right, so you're interrupting the mitzvah, which I said earlier. You make one blessing in the morning, and that blessing covers you all day. So perhaps you've interrupted this thing you've made a blessing for. If you take a nap, you have to make the blessing again. If it's like a really good nap. If it's a cat nap, you don't have to. Basically, they say if you take your shoes off, that's the difference. Other reactions to this?
Well, it makes a person feel insignificant. God does all that, and what am I doing in
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's why he bears guilt in his very life. What is he doing?
Meaning, he should be studying Torah. Anything else is...
Or making the world a more beautiful place, or what is he creating, or what is he doing?
So just noticing the tree is not contributing in any way. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying the tree is all beautiful and wonderful,
Right.
and look how great God is, but how insignificant I am. I can't, and I can say how beautiful it is, but I have no power over it.
There's also an idea that if we haven't done what we're supposed to on this earth, we've wasted our life. Which is a very strong, tall order. It actually comes up in the Machzor and High Holidays, which is exactly when you want to hear that idea. That you haven't made enough of your life, because that's what we do on High Holidays. We get ourselves geared up for doing more, or doing better in the next year. And so if I haven't contributed to this world, then I feel guilt for my life because I haven't done with my life that which I was supposed to do with it. What are some other reactions to this one? Bear guilt for your very life.
I'm not sure about the guilt for the very life, but if you're really learning and concentrating, you shouldn't notice anything else around you.
Right. So maybe you weren't even, maybe it's the problem of multitasking, is not actually focusing and trying to be focusing on the other piece. Also, if you've studied much Pirkei Avot, they really like having these hyperboles of saying, if you embarrass someone, it's as if you've killed that person. So that's a lot of very strong kind of aphorisms, which are strong, important values, and the importance of not embarrassing someone is, I think, a very, very strong value, but then the reaction that, and therefore you've killed that person. So the hyperbole is kind of part of the literary genre of Pirkei Avot. So one possibility perhaps could be this person is so immersed in their study, yet when they see a beautiful tree, they forget to make the bracha. Perhaps it could be that the person is saying how beautiful is a tree, as opposed to brachata maaseh breshit, blessed are you, the one who made creation. So that's one way of reading it, which I think is kind of a dry way of reading it. But another reinterpretation, which I actually have to credit to a friend of mine who loves reading so much that she lives in Jerusalem, and if you're ever in Jerusalem, you will see her because she will be the one walking down the street with a book in front of her face. Which I think is something that, little kids do, and she's, an adult, and she takes a book and she walks, to and from work with a book in front of her face the entire time. So she's someone who knows what it means to walk along the street and study. And the way she reads it is, perhaps someone who's walking along the way and totally immersed in study of Torah, study of God's Word and interpretation of God's Word, and who, when they see a tree and note how beautiful it is, they see it as an interruption. As opposed to someone who's so immersed in what they're studying and in knowing that God works in all sorts of ways in our world, that when they're walking along the way and they see a tree, they don't see it as an interruption. They see it, in fact, as part of their study of God's role in this world. So it's being immersed in the study and not realizing that the thing that you're studying is, in fact, all around us. And thinking the study is an action and living in the world is an action. So perhaps the very guilt for one's life is not being able to integrate this immersive study, this keva, the routine of it all, with the moment and having room in your keva for kavanah.
That's actually very interesting because after reading Heschel, and so I've been trying to do the Shema every morning with kavanah, but I other thoughts come in my head as I'm doing it. I'm trying to concentrate, probably too hard, and so then I sometimes think, well, should I start over? Should I, am I not really focused, in the moment? And then when we read this, I was like,
I'm gonna die.
yeah, I mean, seriously. But maybe it's how I look at it. I'm a busy mom of 3, and my husband travels, and if thoughts of my life come in my head, that is just be thankful that, I have these things to think about, and these, or whatever. maybe it is how I look at it, and not that I'm not doing it right, and that I'm not connecting, that really, I like that. It kind of gives me a different way of thinking about these thoughts that come in my head as I'm trying to say this Shema.
That's great. Integrating our distractions into our spiritual practice, as opposed to thinking of our distractions as being interruptions.
Right. Because otherwise I was being kind of down. I'm not, down on myself or not, That's interesting.
The other thought that's coming to me right now is, if you're walking along with this book in front of your face and you're really studying, why are you seeing this tree? And maybe you're not studying harder.
Right, which is perhaps the multitasking piece, is that if you're going to be studying, just sit there and study. Don't try and walk around.
What gets me is the word guilt. How about if you said non-appreciative?
Of your life.
Yeah, right.
Uh-huh.
But that's different than guilt. Guilt is like, you hit somebody when you shouldn't have, whatever.
So whenever I get this close to what the word means, let's look in the Hebrew and see if we can unpack it a little bit. So mitchayev, the word chayav is often used when someone has done something, when the temple was still standing and someone did something wrong, they had to bring a sacrifice. So it would say chayav, and it would name the kind of sacrifice. So it's that kind of obligated to do to bring a sacrifice. So it's the actual physical thing that they need to bring. Or it's also the word for being obligated to do all of these blessings in the day. It's the the word responsibility or obligation is another way we can translate that. So and then benafsho, it's the word nefesh, which today we use to mean soul, but biblically and Talmudically it means self or person. So it's not the soul part, it's just a human, it means a person. So how can we read it if we say, also it says ke'ilu, it's as if. So there's a kind of something metaphorical or symbolic going on there. So mitchayev, someone is responsible, or let's say responsible with respect to their life. How does that change our understanding of it? Does that go more in the direction that you're thinking?
Yeah.
But I think about going back to the high holiday kind of way of thinking about things. The high holidays are so powerful because we believe that we can actually do better, that we can actually change. But we're not used to thinking in that kind of language throughout the year. So if someone is doing this, whatever this thing is, they're responsible with respect to their life. I think it's identifying there's something maybe broad going on that you need to kind of refocus on here. And perhaps it is the sit and study if you're going to study, and wander around if you're going to wander around, or sometimes sitting and studying is going to be interrupted by all sorts of things. The other piece is looking at the Hebrew. It says, the word for study is shoneh, which also could actually mean not reading, studying, but actually recitation. Because they didn't have, libraries and libraries full of books the way that we do today. So in a Beit Midrash, they wouldn't necessarily have a written text of the Mishnah. They would have someone called a Tana who just knew the entire Mishnah by heart and could recall any piece of it at any moment. And so the person, and also in Aramaic, the taf, the letter taf, there's a lot of letters that in Aramaic and Hebrew can switch back and forth. So shoneh in Aramaic is equivalent to Tana in Hebrew, so shoneh means to recite. So the person might not actually have a book in front of their face, but might actually be walking around reciting, and then it would make a little more sense how they could be distracted because they're not looking. But if they do have a book in front of them, they really ought to be at least having a quarter of one eye in another place. Any more reactions or kind of rereadings of this text?
I brought this for you to keep, to read, because I think that it speaks so much to what we're discussing. It was an essay by Lawrence Kaplan called Kashrut and Kugel, from Franz Rosenzweig's essay on the builders. And in it he says, and I'll just take a couple of words out of it, that Rosenzweig said that you may perform a law, a mitzvah, because after doing it, you hear God's voice. But however, Buber said, one should fulfill a particular commandment only if one is convinced beforehand that the law is addressed to him. And I find that kind of, that contrast, the rest of it goes into it in depth, it's fascinating. But that concept of keva and keva now, when does it become a part of me, and when am I just saying it? And should I know what I'm doing before I do it, or as many children were taught a long time ago, because I said so?
Right.
Thank
you. It's the balance of, do I do this because I know it will be meaningful, or do I do this because it's an obligation, it's a mitzvah, because my mom said to, because my friends find it meaningful, because I know other people like to wake up every day and put on tefillin. It seems absurd to me, but maybe I'm going to take a leap of faith. And it goes back to Heschel's metaphor that most of our actions, the purpose is transparent. They're like glass. We can see through. Before I brush my teeth are dirty. Afterwards, they are clean. And then his metaphor of the diamond is like mitzvot. We know that a diamond is beautiful, but we can't see the depth of that prism until we've spent a lot more time examining it. So now, so far, each text we've had has had more or less kind of one voice and one direction it's gone in. Now we're going to turn to the back and look at a little piece of Talmud that's going to have in it both directions. It's a conversation about the keva, the kavanah, the spontaneous, the routine, the extemporaneous, and the scripted. All right, I'm going to do this one so I can interrupt myself. It begins, Benjamin the shepherd made a sandwich. So a sandwich has bread in it, right? So that's going to be a motzi, hand washing, motzi, 3 blessings, full of birkat hamazon. And after he ate it, he said, "Blessed be the master of this bread." And Rav said that he had not performed his obligation of 3 blessings afterwards. But they respond, but doesn't Rav teach? Oh, so he's saying that hasn't performed the obligation, and why hasn't he performed the obligation? Because doesn't Rav teach that any blessing in which God's name is not mentioned is no blessing? So they're kind of getting at the formula, what makes something a blessing? So therefore we must suppose Benjamin the shepherd said, "Blessed be the all-merciful, the master of this bread." So the obligation is to say Birkat Hamazon, and the question is what fulfills one's obligation to say Birkat Hamazon? One problem is that for what makes a blessing a blessing? We're used to the formula, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. So it's the blessing part, it's addressing it to God, using God's name, we usually say Adonai Eloheinu, and then declaring God the ruler of the universe. Those are kind of the basic parts in a blessing. But here they're boiling it down a little bit more simple than that and saying, we just need to make sure he's mentioning God's name. And I love that the name that gets inserted is not the typical Adonai or Eloheinu, it's the all-merciful, Rahmana. It's not picking the main names of God, it's of the 70-plus names of God, they pick a pretty awesome one. Actually, awesome is probably not the right word, because it's not God's compassion. In the strict religious sense of awe, compassion is not an awesome one. Compassion is more of the intimate, loving, closer one. So Benjamin the shepherd, picture this shepherd in the middle of, hills and fields like Moses wandering around, and he makes himself a lunch, and he's moved to say, or perhaps he feels obligated, somewhere in the middle, and he said, "Blessed be the all-merciful, compassionate master of this bread." And now they're going to try and figure out a little bit more. Has he really said his obligation? Has he really done the keva side of things? It seems like the kavanah is there, but what do we do with the keva piece? But don't we require 3 blessings? So the first blessing in Birkat Hamazon ends Hazan et Hakol, who feeds all. Aretz V'al Hamazon, it's the blessing about the land of Israel and on sustenance. And the third one, B'nei Barach Hamav Yerushalayim. So at this point, Benjamin the shepherd has only made the first one, the food part. He hasn't mentioned the land of Israel or Jerusalem. What did Rav mean by saying that he had performed his obligation? He meant he had performed the obligation of the first blessing. But then in the Talmud, if there's a teaching, but the person responding thinks they already knew that teaching, They want to unpack the teaching a little more and see what's the new lesson we learned in this. So what does this tell us that we did not already know? That he's performed his obligation, even if he says it in a secular language. Oh, you can't tell in the English, but the blessing that the shepherd said was in Aramaic. It wasn't in Hebrew. So if you are to look at the original text, you'll notice, no matter how familiar you are with Hebrew, it's going to look like a foreign language. It's the same language as all of the Kaddishes, Yikadav, Yikadash. So perhaps what we've learned is that even though he said it in Aramaic, it still fulfilled his obligation. Meaning if we say, praise be God, we get points for praising God even though we said it in English. But they respond, but we already know this. We already know there's a whole list of things that if we say it in our language, we're fulfilled. So the ritual of sota, which is the wife who's suspected of adultery, the confession over tithes, recitation of the Shema, the Amidah, the grace after food. So they say the point of this teaching can't be that even though Benjamin spoke in Aramaic, it's fine. It must be something else, because we already knew you can say Birkat Hamazon in English, in Aramaic, in Spanish, in any language. So then they're saying, so what can we learn from this? Benjamin said this blessing and it counted. What's the new lesson in this piece? It required to be stated, meaning it teaches us something new, because you might have thought that this is only the case in the grace after meals in a secular language if it's in the same form as was instituted by the rabbis in the Holy Tongue. Meaning you might have thought that you could only say Birkat Hamazon in English if you're actually reading a translation of Birkat Hamazon. That you can only do the Shema if you're doing a translation, as opposed to expressing from your heart the values and the principles held in the Shema. So you might have thought that if one does not say it in the secular language in the same form as instituted by the rabbis in the Holy Tongue, he has not performed his obligation. Meaning, from this where it says he fulfilled his obligation, we learn not only does it not have to be in Hebrew, but it doesn't have to be the same form, the translation of the Hebrew. Just saying something in the same spirit in one's own language is sufficient for Birkat Hamazon. So looking at our kind of list over here, so the Shema and the Amidah, they put in the category of a translation is necessary. But in Birkat Hamazon, just expressing the feeling, the principle, is enough. So we're going to put the enough to the side and how we feel about the requirement piece of it. But this is quite freeing. Especially thinking about Benjamin the shepherd, probably doesn't have a siddur, probably doesn't have a little nifty bencher in his pocket. He's wandering around in the fields and wants to still stay connected. And I think that's partially about our lives. Wandering around in the fields, no longer in the shtetl where many of our families came from, where it was easier to do all of this. So as we're wandering in the fields as shepherds in this world, that there is even, and that we're not the first generation who struggled to maintain this kind of connection in a world that doesn't necessarily enable it. That since the Talmud, they've recognized that people want to be engaging with God, doing these mitzvot, and living in this kind of way, but haven't been able to use the language, which connects our own personal kind of search to, our people millennia ago. Any closing reactions?
It means that we're connected to God, no matter how we say it and how we express it. That using the Hebrew connects us to Jews all over the world. So why are we saying the blessing? To connect us to Jews, or are we saying it to really thank God? So I found that interesting. Also, I was that with Aramaic, and I was reading it, trying to read the Hebrew, and then I came to the part where it said pita, and I knew that was.
Right, so pita is an Aramaic word for bread.
bread,
so it'll
yeah.
be the very last word of the first paragraph in Hebrew. It turns in, that's the word pita. And actually then the next two paragraphs are actually in Hebrew, which Talmudic scholars will tell you that this is one of the proofs of the different layers of how the Talmud was written at different times, because the language kind of changes between different paragraphs, which is very cool, but that's another subject.
I don't like the word God. I find it too limiting.
Okay.
I like when if I say something, I say the powerful force that I really don't understand that's controlling everything. To me, it's sort of cumbersome,
Right.
but it's more what I feel. You know, when people think of God, they think of some whirling thing or whatever. But if you say the force, then it's more eternal or universal. I don't know.
Right, God is efficient as a word and limiting. Or the other thing with saying the word God is we have no idea what pops into everyone's head when we say the word God. But there's a lot of baggage there. Whereas when you say that phrase, I'm assuming none of us have references for that phrase, and so there's something a lot more open. But that would be a harder way to engage.
Yeah. I mean, that's not wrong, is it?
Right. No. I was actually reading a piece published by the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary yesterday, encouraging people to try out rabbinical school if you're even thinking about it. And he said in it, when he chose not, someone told him many years ago he should go to rabbinical school, and he said, I can't, I don't have the faith. And he's kind of unpacking why that's not actually kind of the pivot point for whether or not you should go. And then at the end he says, and you don't have to have an answer about God, because at JTS we certainly don't have an answer about God. But part of it is trying to figure out in what ways can we speak about God, because one option is just to not talk about God because you can't find the right words. The other option is to fumble. And I think that fumbling is a much better route than abstaining. So I hope that you'll take away these two words, keva and kavanah, and the balance of the different sides that each one can enable for us. And this has been a real pleasure learning with all of you the past couple of weeks. I wish it could have been 3 weeks, but I'm grateful for that we have had. So thank you very, very much.